The morning mist clung to the ancient Douglas firs like whispered secrets, and the only sound breaking Cedar Falls wilderness was the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath worn hiking boots. Ben Torres moved through the forest with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged here, his weathered hands collecting dry kindling, while 6-year-old Maya's crayon-bright maple leaf drawing rustled in his breast pocket. Then the silence shattered. A cry for help, weak but unmistakably desperate, drifted up from the rocky ravine 20 feet below. What he found when he rappelled down changed everything he thought he knew about power, about wealth, about the kind of person who ends up broken and alone in the middle of nowhere. She sat against the moss-covered granite, designer silk blouse torn and stained with earth, bare feet bleeding, clutching a shattered iPhone like a lifeline to a world she could no longer reach. When she looked up at him, her eyes held the commanding presence of someone accustomed to boardroom victories and million-dollar decisions. But beneath that carefully constructed authority was something raw and terrifying. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. "Don't let them find me here." Ben's ranger training kicked in automatically, his hands already reaching for the first aid kit strapped to his belt. The woman's left ankle was swollen, angry purple bruising spreading beneath torn designer stockings that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. But it was her eyes that held him captive, not the injury. Those weren't the eyes of someone who'd simply taken a wrong turn on a hiking trail. They belonged to someone running from something far more dangerous than getting lost in the Oregon wilderness. "Mom, you're hurt," he said gently, the same tone he used when Maya woke from nightmares about the mother she barely remembered. "Let me help you up to my cabin. We need to get that ankle looked at." She flinched when he moved closer, her whole body tensing like a cornered animal. "I can't," she breathed, clutching the broken phone tighter. "If they track the GPS, if they find out where I am—" Her voice trailed off, but the fear in it was louder than any scream. The woman's hands trembled as Ben carefully wrapped her ankle with medical tape, her designer rings catching what little sunlight filtered through the canopy above. She moved with an odd contradiction, simultaneously fragile and commanding, like someone used to having others handle every detail of her life, yet tough enough to survive a night alone in the wilderness. "What's your name?" Ben asked, keeping his voice steady and non-threatening. She hesitated for what felt like an eternity, her gaze darting between his face and the steep ravine walls surrounding them. "Alex," she finally said, and something about the way she said it suggested it wasn't the whole truth. Ben didn't push. In his 18 months as a widower, he'd learned that some people needed time before they were ready to share their real stories. "Well, Alex, I'm Ben, and right now the only thing that matters is getting you somewhere safe and warm." The relief that washed over her face was so profound it almost knocked him backward. The walk back to Ben's cabin took nearly 40 minutes, with Alex leaning heavily on his shoulder and wincing with each step. She said nothing about the modest ranger station he called home, though he caught her studying the hand-carved wind chimes Anna had made during her final summer, the vegetable garden Maya helped tend, the pile of split firewood that represented hours of evening work after his daughter went to bed. When the front door burst open and Maya came running out in her favorite unicorn pajamas, Ben watched Alex's entire demeanor shift. The commanding presence softened into something almost vulnerable, as if she'd forgotten what it felt like to see pure, uncomplicated joy in another person's face. "Daddy, is she hurt like Mommy was?" Maya asked with the brutal honesty that only 6-year-olds possessed. Ben's chest tightened at the innocent question that always managed to find the tender spots in his carefully constructed new normal. "She's hurt differently, sweetheart, but we're going to help her feel better, okay?" Alex's gratitude was quiet but absolute as Ben settled her on the living room couch with Maya's favorite fuzzy blanket and a cup of coffee that was probably the first thing she'd consumed in hours. She accepted his offer to stay until her ankle healed, with the kind of relief that suggested she truly had nowhere else to go. But it was the way she thanked him that stuck with Ben long after Maya had chattered herself to sleep that night. Not with the performative politeness of someone accustomed to service, but with genuine surprise, as if kindness without expectation was a foreign concept in her world. "I was supposed to meet my driver today," she said carefully, catching herself before revealing too much, "but I don't think that's going to happen anymore." The way she stared at her broken phone suggested that whatever life she'd been living had ended the moment she'd fallen into that ravine. Ben found himself wondering what kind of world she came from, where accepting help from a stranger felt like such a monumental risk. The first few days fell into an unexpectedly natural rhythm. Alex woke before dawn, silently padding to the kitchen where she'd find Ben already preparing Maya's breakfast and lunch for school. She'd learned to make coffee the way professional baristas did, though she never explained where she'd acquired that particular skill. Maya, with the adaptability of childhood, simply accepted Alex's presence as if mysterious women recovering from forest accidents were a normal part of their routine. "Can you do the funny voices again?" Maya would beg each morning, and Alex would transform into pirates and princesses and talking animals with a theatrical flair that suggested either natural talent or expensive training. Ben watched these interactions with growing fascination, noting how Alex seemed to come alive when Maya laughed, as if she were remembering some essential part of herself she'd lost along the way. But it was the small things that intrigued him most. The way Alex instinctively knew which fork to use for salad, how she reflexively reached for her phone every few minutes before remembering it was broken, the careful way she spoke about her past, always in vague generalities that revealed nothing concrete. By the end of the first week, Alex had become an integral part of their evening routine. She'd help Maya with homework while Ben prepared dinner, and somehow she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of environmental science that made Maya's school projects come alive with details about carbon footprints and sustainable living practices. "How do you know so much about saving polar bears?" Maya asked one night, her crayon poised over a drawing of melting ice caps. Alex's answer came with the passionate intensity of someone who'd spent considerable time thinking about such things. "We start by changing how big companies think, sweetie. Sometimes the people in charge don't realize how much damage they're causing until someone shows them a different way." Ben glanced up from the stove, struck by the authority in her voice when she spoke about corporate responsibility. It was the tone of someone who understood exactly how those systems worked, not from the outside looking in, but from somewhere deep within the machinery itself. When Alex caught him staring, she quickly shifted the conversation back to Maya's homework, but the moment lingered between them, like an unasked question. The second week brought a comfortable domesticity that surprised them both. Alex insisted on contributing to household chores, though her technique suggested someone learning these skills for the first time. She approached cooking with the methodical precision of someone following a complex business plan, measuring ingredients with scientific accuracy, while Ben taught her that sometimes the best meals came from intuition rather than exactitude. "You don't have to make it perfect," he told her as she fretted over slightly unevenly diced onions. "Maya and I were pretty easy to please." The grateful smile she gave him suggested that the concept of easy to please was revolutionary in her experience. During those quiet evening hours after Maya went to bed, they'd sit on the front porch while Alex peppered him with questions about forest management, wildlife conservation, and the daily challenges of protecting thousands of acres of wilderness with limited resources. Her questions weren't casual curiosity. They had the focused intensity of someone building a comprehensive understanding of complex systems. It was during one of these evening conversations that Ben noticed the way Alex tensed whenever aircraft passed overhead. A commercial flight would send her reaching for the broken phone before she caught herself, and the distant thrum of helicopter blades made her go completely still, like prey sensing a predator. She tried to hide these reactions, but Ben had spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize the signs of someone being hunted. "Alex," he said one night, and she visibly flinched at the sound of a small plane passing over. "What exactly are you running from?" She was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions that had cost her everything. "The kind of people who don't take no for an answer," she said simply. "The kind who think money can solve any problem and control any person." Ben studied her profile in the dim porch light, noting the way her hands clenched when she talked about control, the bitter edge that crept into her voice when she mentioned money. Whatever world she'd escaped from, it had left marks that went far deeper than a twisted ankle. The morning of the 11th day shattered their peaceful routine with the brutality of a natural disaster. Ben was leading a group of forestry students through the eastern section of the preserve when smoke began rising from the valley below, and within minutes the radio was crackling with emergency protocols for a fast-moving wildfire. His training took over, coordinating evacuation routes and calling for additional resources. But it was Alex's voice that cut through the chaos like a knife through silk. "This is Alexandra Hartwell," she said into her somehow functional backup phone, her tone carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to commanding immediate attention. "I need aerial support at coordinates 44.7 north, 121.9 west. Emergency wildfire suppression, priority Alpha." Ben's blood turned to ice water as the pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Alexandra Hartwell wasn't just any billionaire, she was the CEO of Hartwell Environmental Corporation, the company currently pushing legislation to clear-cut 50,000 acres of Oregon wilderness for industrial development. The woman he'd been sharing breakfast with for nearly 2 weeks was the architect of everything he'd spent his career fighting against. The confrontation came that evening after the fire had been contained and the forestry students safely evacuated. Ben stood in his kitchen, staring at Alex as if seeing her for the first time, while Maya played with her coloring books in the living room, blissfully unaware that their world was about to implode. "So," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in his chest. "Alexandra Hartwell, CEO of the company that wants to turn this entire forest into a logging operation?" Alex's face went pale, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she squared her shoulders with the kind of dignity that only came from years of facing hostile boardrooms and aggressive shareholders. "Yes," she said simply. "That's who I am. Or rather, that's who I was." Ben laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter recognition of betrayal. "Was? So what, you just decided to take a vacation from destroying the environment? Thought you'd slum it with the little people for a few days before going back to your corporate empire?" The hurt that flashed across Alex's face was so genuine it almost made him step back, but the anger was too fresh, too raw. "You know exactly who I am," he continued, his voice rising despite his efforts to keep Maya from hearing. "You know this is my job, my life, my daughter's future. And you've been sitting at my table, playing house with my kid, while planning to destroy everything we love." Alex's composure cracked like ice under pressure, and suddenly Ben could see the woman who'd been hiding behind the carefully constructed mask of corporate authority. "You think I wanted this?" she said, her voice shaking with emotion she could no longer contain. "You think I chose to inherit a company built on destroying everything beautiful in this world? You think I haven't spent every day for the past 3 years trying to find a way out of the legacy my family forced on me?" Tears were streaming down her face now, and Ben realized this was the first time he'd seen her cry, even when she'd been hurt and alone in that ravine. "I came here to disappear, Ben. I was supposed to sign papers that would clear-cut this entire forest, and instead I literally fell off a cliff trying to run away from that meeting. Every morning I've woken up in your house has been borrowed time, a glimpse of the kind of life I thought I could never have." She gestured helplessly at the modest cabin, at Maya's artwork covering the refrigerator, at the simple life they'd built together over 11 precious days. "Do you have any idea what it's like to discover that happiness doesn't require anything you thought was important?" The weight of her words hung between them like smoke from the morning's fire, and Ben felt his anger wavering in the face of her obvious pain. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the evening quiet. Through the window, Ben could see black SUVs pulling into his driveway, followed by news vans and photographers with cameras large enough to capture wildlife from a distance. "They found me," Alex whispered, and the fear that had been hiding behind her corporate mask for 11 days finally broke free. An elderly man in an expensive suit emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by men who moved with the controlled precision of private security. Even from 50 yards away, Ben could see the family resemblance in the sharp angles of his face, the commanding presence that Alex had inherited along with her burdens. "Alexandra," the man called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "It's time to come home. The board has made their decision about your extended absence." Alex's hands were shaking as she turned to Ben, and in her eyes he saw not the CEO who commanded billion-dollar corporations, but the frightened woman he'd found broken in that ravine. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen to you." The next few hours unfolded with the surreal quality of a nightmare. Theodore Hartwell, Alex's grandfather and the true power behind Hartwell Environmental Corporation, had come prepared for war. Private investigators presented carefully constructed evidence suggesting that Ben had kidnapped his granddaughter for ransom, complete with fabricated communications and doctored financial records that painted him as a desperate man driven to extremes by his precarious economic situation. The media narrative wrote itself. Unstable single father, recently widowed, struggling to make ends meet, sees an opportunity when a wealthy woman literally falls into his lap. "This man," Theodore announced to the assembled reporters, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone accustomed to shaping public opinion, "has held my granddaughter against her will for nearly 2 weeks, exploiting her vulnerability and manipulating her emotional state for his own financial gain." Ben watched in stunned disbelief as FBI agents approached his cabin with arrest warrants, while Maya pressed her face against the living room window, too young to understand why her father was being handcuffed, but old enough to know that their world was ending. The legal machinery moved with terrifying efficiency. Within hours, Ben found himself in a federal holding cell, while Maya was placed in emergency protective custody, her tearful questions about when Daddy was coming home echoing in his mind like a torture device. Alex had been whisked away in one of the black SUVs before he could say goodbye, before he could tell her that despite everything, despite the lies and the deception, he understood why she'd run. The charges were serious enough to make national headlines: kidnapping, extortion, child endangerment, and the evidence Theodore's team had manufactured was compelling enough to convince even Ben's own attorney that a plea bargain might be the best option. "They have emails from your computer," his court-appointed lawyer explained during their first meeting, "communications that suggest you knew exactly who she was from the beginning. Phone records that show you contacting ransom negotiators. Financial documents indicating you were facing foreclosure on your cabin." Ben stared at the fabricated evidence with growing horror, recognizing the professional thoroughness of people who could rewrite reality itself. "None of this is real," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, He knew that truth had become irrelevant in the face of unlimited resources and political influence. 3 weeks passed like a slow-motion car crash. Ben's bail hearing was delayed repeatedly due to scheduling conflicts that his lawyer explained were actually pressure from federal prosecutors seeking to make an example of his case. Maya remained in foster care, her weekly supervised visits with Ben providing the only light in an otherwise unbearable situation. She'd grown quiet and withdrawn, no longer the chattering, curious child who'd brought such joy to their simple life. "When is Alex coming back?" she asked during one visit, her small hand clutching the maple leaf drawing that had somehow survived the chaos of their destroyed home. "I want to show her my new pictures." Ben's heart broke a little more each time he had to explain that Alex couldn't visit, that sometimes grown-ups had problems too complicated for little girls to understand. Meanwhile, the media circus continued to feast on their story, with talking heads debating everything from single father competency to the psychological profiles of modern kidnappers. Ben watched from his cell as his reputation, his career, and his credibility were systematically destroyed by people with the resources to make lies sound more convincing than truth. The evening everything changed began with rain. Not the gentle Oregon drizzle that Ben had grown to love, but a torrential downpour that turned Cedar Falls' quiet streets into rushing streams and sent everyone indoors to weather the storm. Ben was reading one of Maya's letters for the 100th time when the corrections officer appeared at his cell door with news that would either save him or destroy him completely. "You've got a visitor," the guard said, his expression unreadable. "Says she's got information about your case." Ben's heart hammered against his ribs as he was led to the visiting room, expecting to see his lawyer or perhaps a journalist looking for an exclusive interview. Instead, he found Alex sitting at the metal table, her designer clothes replaced by jeans and a simple sweater, her perfectly styled hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger and somehow more real than she ever had in his cabin. She'd lost weight during their separation, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. But when she looked up at him, her gaze held a determination he'd never seen before, the kind of steel-backed resolve that came from finally choosing a side in a war that had been raging long before he'd ever fallen into her life. "I gave up everything," Alex said without preamble, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was telling him. "Signed over controlling interest in Hartwell Environmental to my grandfather, relinquished my board position, transferred my voting shares to the family trust. I'm no longer CEO, no longer heir apparent, no longer anything but another unemployed citizen with a law degree and a very expensive education in environmental science." Ben stared at her across the small table, trying to process the implications of what she'd just revealed. "The kidnapping charges will be dropped within 24 hours," she continued, pulling a thick folder of legal documents from her bag. "I've provided testimony, sworn affidavits, and electronic evidence proving that I came to your cabin voluntarily and remained there of my own free will. My grandfather's private investigators have been given new instructions, and the fabricated evidence against you is being formally retracted." She leaned forward, her eyes intense with the same passion he'd seen when she talked to Maya about saving polar bears. "But that's just the beginning, Ben. I've spent the last 3 weeks liquidating every personal asset I could access without board approval. Real estate, art collections, investment portfolios, everything my trust fund accumulated over the years." The folder Alex placed in front of him contained documents that would change not just his life, but the entire future of environmental protection in Oregon. Hartwell Environmental's clear-cutting proposal depends on a series of shell companies purchasing adjacent land parcels, she explained, spreading maps and legal documents across the table with the precision of a military strategist. "I bought every single one of those parcels through private sales, then immediately transferred them to the Oregon Environmental Trust as protected conservation land. The logging project is dead, Ben. Permanently. But it was the final document that took his breath away. Incorporation papers for a new non-profit organization called the Torres Hartwell Environmental Law Center, with Ben listed as executive director and Alex as lead counsel. "I'm not going back to corporate life," she said simply. "I can't undo the damage my family's company has caused over the decades, but I can spend whatever time I have left fighting to prevent more of it. If you'll have me as a partner." The visiting room felt too small to contain the magnitude of what she was offering, not just a professional collaboration, but a complete transformation of both their lives. Ben's voice was hoarse when he finally found words to respond. "Alex, do you understand what you've done? You've given up billions of dollars, your entire inheritance, your family. What happens when the money runs out? What happens when Theodore decides you're more trouble than you're worth?" Alex's smile was sad but genuine, carrying the peace that came from finally making a choice that aligned with her deepest values. "Then I'll have lived authentically for whatever time remains," she said. "Ben, for 29 years I've been Alexandra Hartwell, heir to an environmental destruction empire, and I've hated every minute of it. For 11 days in your cabin I got to be Alex, just Alex, helping a little girl with her homework and learning how to make coffee without a personal assistant. Those were the best 11 days of my life." She reached across the table and touched his hand, and he felt the calluses she'd developed from helping with his firewood, evidence of a life lived in service to something greater than profit margins. "I can't promise you wealth or comfort or any of the things my old life could have provided, but I can promise you purpose, partnership, and every day I have left to fight for the things that matter." The reintegration into normal life took months of careful rebuilding. Maya's return from foster care was joyful, but complicated, requiring patience and counseling to help her process the trauma of their separation. Ben's reinstatement as head ranger came with a promotion and expanded authority over conservation efforts throughout the Pacific Northwest, while Alex established their law center in a converted warehouse in downtown Cedar Falls. Their partnership was professional and purposeful, built on shared values rather than romantic complications, though Ben sometimes caught himself watching Alex as she worked late into the evening, surrounded by legal briefs and environmental impact studies. With the same intensity she'd once applied to Maya's homework, she'd kept her promise about authenticity, trading designer suits for practical work clothes, corporate boardrooms for community meetings with local farmers and tribal representatives. The transformation was so complete that sometimes Ben forgot she'd ever been anyone other than the woman who made terrible jokes while teaching Maya to identify bird calls. Their first major victory came 8 months after Alex's testimony freed Ben from federal charges. Hartwell Environmental Corporation, weakened by internal conflicts following Alexandra's dramatic departure and facing multiple lawsuits from her whistleblower revelations, filed for bankruptcy and was dissolved by court order. Theodore Hartwell, facing federal charges for evidence tampering and conspiracy, agreed to a plea bargain that included transferring an additional 12,000 acres of Oregon forest land to conservation trusts. "He called me yesterday," Alex told Ben as they reviewed the settlement documents. "First time we've spoken since I walked away from the company. He wanted to know if I was happy with what I'd accomplished." Ben looked up from the legal paperwork, studying Alex's expression for clues about how that conversation had affected her. "What did you tell him?" Alex's answer came with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found their true calling. "I told him I sleep better at night than I have since I was Maya's age. The law center grew steadily, attracting environmental attorneys from across the country who wanted to work for purpose rather than profit. Alex proved to be a formidable advocate, her insider knowledge of corporate environmental law combined with genuine passion, creating a legal strategy that corporate opponents found impossible to counter. Ben watched her argue cases with the same intensity she'd once brought to bedtime stories, transforming complex legal precedents into compelling narratives about protecting irreplaceable ecosystems for future generations. Maya, now 7.5, had appointed herself the law center's unofficial mascot, arriving after school each day to help file documents and ask endless questions about why some people wanted to hurt forests. "Miss Alex," she said one afternoon while carefully organizing legal briefs, "when I grow up, can I be a forest lawyer too?" Alex's response carried the weight of dreams she'd never been allowed to pursue. "Sweetheart, you can be anything you want to be. That's the whole point of everything we're fighting for." The end came quietly, without drama or fanfare, on a Tuesday morning in early spring when the Douglas firs were just beginning to show their new growth. Ben had noticed Alex's cough getting worse over the winter months, though she'd dismissed his concerns with the same stubborn independence that had driven her to walk away from billions of dollars. When she finally agreed to see a doctor, the diagnosis was both swift and devastating. Advanced lung cancer, almost certainly caused by decades of exposure to industrial chemicals during her time overseeing Hartwell Environmental's manufacturing operations. "How long?" Ben asked the oncologist, though Alex's calm acceptance of the news had already provided most of the answer. 6 months, maybe 8 with aggressive treatment, came the reply that changed everything once again. Alex listened to the treatment options with the same analytical precision she brought to legal research, but Ben could see in her eyes that she'd already made her decision about how she wanted to spend whatever time remained. Alex chose quality over quantity, trading chemotherapy for hiking trails and legal briefs for long conversations with Maya about the importance of protecting beautiful things. She worked until her body wouldn't let her continue, spending her final weeks in Ben's cabin surrounded by the forest sounds that had become the soundtrack to her transformation from corporate executive to environmental warrior. Maya, with the adaptability of childhood and the wisdom of someone who'd already lost one important woman in her life, appointed herself Alex's caretaker, reading stories and bringing wildflower bouquets with the same dedication she'd once shown to homework assignments. "Are you scared?" Maya asked one afternoon as they sat on the front porch, watching a family of deer graze in the meadow beyond. Alex's answer was honest, but gentle. "Not scared, sweetheart. Just grateful that I got to know what it feels like to live for something bigger than myself." The funeral was small but meaningful, attended by environmental lawyers, forest rangers, and tribal elders whose land had been preserved through Alex's legal work. Maya insisted on speaking, standing at the podium in her best dress to tell the assembled mourners about how Alex had taught her that love wasn't about staying forever, but about what you chose to leave behind. Ben watched his daughter with pride and heartbreak, marveling at the wisdom that loss had forced her to develop far too early. The Alexandra Hartwell Environmental Law Center would continue operating with a substantial endowment Alex had established, ensuring that her legal team could represent communities fighting corporate environmental destruction for decades to come. Her personal papers, including a detailed memoir about her transformation from billionaire heiress to environmental advocate, would be published posthumously with proceeds benefiting forest conservation efforts throughout the Pacific Northwest. 3 years later, Ben stood at the entrance to Alex's trail, the hiking path through Cedar Falls wilderness that had been dedicated in her memory, watching Maya lead a group of 4th graders on their first official nature walk. At 9 years old, his daughter moved through the forest with the same quiet confidence that had once belonged to him alone, pointing out different tree species and explaining the ecological importance of old-growth forests with an authority that would have made Alex proud. The memorial plaque at the trailhead bore a simple inscription: Alexandra Hartwell, 1994 to 2028. She taught us that love isn't about staying, it's about what you leave behind. Visitors often paused to read those words, many of them unaware that the woman honored there had once commanded a corporate empire worth billions of dollars before choosing a different kind of legacy. Maya paused her nature lecture to approach the memorial plaque, her young face serious as she addressed her student group. "This lady used to live with my dad and me," she explained with the matter-of-fact tone that children used for profound truths. "She was really rich, but she gave up all her money to save trees. Some people think that was crazy, but I think it was brave." One of the older students raised her hand with a question that adults had been asking for 3 years. If she was so rich, why did she want to live in the woods instead? Maya's answer came with the wisdom of someone who'd witnessed extraordinary transformation firsthand. Because she learned that being happy doesn't cost anything. It just means choosing to protect the things you love more than the things you own. Ben felt his throat tighten as he listened to his daughter unconsciously echo the lessons Alex had taught them, both during their brief time together. As the student group continued down the trail, chattering about what they'd learned and debating which trees were their favorites, Ben remained by the memorial plaque for a few extra minutes. The forest around him was thriving, protected in perpetuity by legal frameworks Alex had spent her final years constructing. Hartwell Environmental's former logging sites had been replanted with native species, and wildlife populations were recovering in areas that had been slated for industrial development. The Torres Hartwell Environmental Law Center had grown into a regional powerhouse, representing indigenous communities, family farmers, and grassroots conservation groups in legal battles against corporations that viewed natural resources as commodities to be exploited. None of this would have existed without Alexandra Hartwell's decision to climb down into that ravine 3 years ago, to choose authenticity over inheritance, purpose over profit. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as Ben finally turned to follow Maya and her student group back toward the ranger station. In the distance, he could hear their voices discussing plans for a tree-planting ceremony, their enthusiasm reminding him of another little girl who'd once drawn maple leaves with crayon-bright optimism. Alex had been right about legacy. It wasn't about monuments or buildings or even the money she'd given up to protect this forest. It lived in Maya's confident voice as she taught other children to value what couldn't be bought or sold, in the legal precedents that would protect wilderness areas for generations to come, in the simple recognition that some things were more important than any price tag. The wind stirred through the Douglas firs above, carrying the sound of children's laughter and the promise of tomorrow's conservation efforts. And Ben realized that Alex had never really left them at all. She'd simply transformed into something larger and more permanent than any single life could contain. The ongoing commitment to choose what was right over what was easy, what was sustainable over what was profitable, what was loving over what was merely convenient. Maya ran back to meet him as he approached the ranger station, her backpack full of pine cones and her notebook filled with observations about forest ecosystems that would become next week's science project. "Dad," she said, slipping her small hand into his weathered one, "do you think Alex knows about all the trees we've saved since she died?" Ben looked down at his daughter, this remarkable little person who'd learned about loss and purpose and the importance of fighting for what you believed in before she'd even reached double digits. His answer came from a place deeper than memory, from the part of his heart where love transformed into legacy. "I think she lives in every choice we make to protect something beautiful, sweetheart. Every tree we save, every trail we preserve, every person we teach to love this forest the way we do. That's Alex still working." Maya nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the same grace she'd shown when Alex had first explained that sometimes grown-ups had to make difficult choices for reasons children might not understand until they were older. As they walked toward home together, the evening light turning the forest golden around them, Ben felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life lived in service to something greater than personal ambition. Alexandra Hartwell had taught him that heroism didn't require grand gestures or perfect circumstances. Sometimes it was as simple as choosing to help a stranger, as quiet as offering kindness without expectation, as profound as sacrificing everything you'd been taught to value for the sake of what truly mattered. Their story had become part of Cedar Falls folklore, told and retold by hiking guides and environmental educators who understood that the most powerful transformations often began with the smallest acts of compassion. In ranger stations and law schools, in tribal council meetings and community organizing sessions, people spoke of the billionaire who'd given up everything to save a forest and the single father who'd shown her what authentic living looked like. But Ben knew the real story was simpler and more complex than any legend could capture. It was about two broken people who'd found healing in service to something larger than themselves, about a little girl who'd learned that love meant protecting what you treasured most, about the recognition that some choices echoed through generations in ways the choosers could never fully anticipate or control. The porch light was on when they reached the cabin, casting a warm glow over the hand-carved wind chimes Anna had made, and the vegetable garden Maya tended with the same care Alex had once shown to legal briefs. Inside, dinner was waiting. Simple food prepared with attention and eaten with gratitude, the kind of meal that Alex had learned to appreciate during her 11 days of discovering what wealth actually meant. After Maya had gone to bed, Ben sat in his favorite chair reading case files from the law center, preparing for tomorrow's meetings about expanding conservation protections to additional forest areas throughout Oregon. The work continued, as Alex had known it would, carried forward by people who understood that environmental protection was ultimately about love. Love for places too beautiful to lose, love for creatures too valuable to sacrifice, love for a future worth preserving, despite the cost. And in the quiet moments between legal documents and conservation plans, Ben could still feel her presence in the choices he made, the values he taught Maya, the commitment to choose authenticity over convenience that had become the foundation of everything meaningful in their lives. The reception lasted until well past midnight, filled with dancing, laughter, and the kind of celebration that happens when a community comes together to witness love triumph over circumstances. Amy danced with Ben to their wedding song, an old Johnny Cash tune about finding redemption in unexpected places, and later with Lily to a Disney soundtrack, both of them giggling as they spun around the makeshift dance floor. As the evening wound down and guests began filtering home, Amy found herself standing outside the community center, looking up at the star-filled Oregon sky and marveling at the journey that had brought her here. A year and a half ago, she'd been Amelia Thornfield, heir to a corporate empire built on others' suffering, sleepwalking through a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt empty at its core. Tonight, she was Amy Carter, wife to a carpenter, mother to a 7-year-old with dreams of becoming a concert pianist, and member of a community that measured wealth in kindness rather than bank balances. Ben appeared beside her, loosening his tie as he wrapped an arm around her waist. "No regrets?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Amy leaned into his warmth, breathing in the scent of sawdust and contentment that always seemed to surround him. "Only that it took a runaway truck to bring us together," she said. "But I suppose some of the best things in life are worth waiting for, even when you don't know you're waiting." 18 months later, Amy stood at the kitchen window of their house. Officially their house now, the apartment above the bookstore having been vacated in favor of the home they'd built together, watching Ben teach Lily and her friend Madison how to build a treehouse in the old oak behind the garden. The project had been ongoing for weeks, with Ben patiently explaining concepts of structural engineering while the girls contributed enthusiasm and an endless supply of questions. Amy smiled as she watched her husband demonstrate proper hammer technique, remembering how her own father had viewed children as inconveniences to be managed rather than individuals to be nurtured. The contrast still amazed her sometimes. How different love looked when it wasn't conditional on performance or achievement. On the kitchen counter, Anna's music box sat open, its two dancers spinning their eternal waltz while Lily's latest composition played softly from the tablet nearby. The little girl had been working on a piece she called Family Song, and though it was technically simple, it captured something essential about their life together. Harmony that didn't require perfection. Melody that made room for all voices. The phone rang, interrupting Amy's contented observation of the backyard construction project. Agent Martinez's number appeared on the caller ID, a reminder that her past occasionally intruded on her present in the form of legal updates and security briefings. Harrison's parole hearing has been scheduled for next spring, Martinez informed her without preamble. His lawyers are arguing for early release based on good behavior and deteriorating health. I wanted you to know in case you decide to provide victim impact testimony. Amy closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of decisions that rippled beyond her immediate family. Will my testimony make a difference? She asked. Possibly. But you've fulfilled your legal obligations. This choice is entirely yours. After hanging up, Amy remained at the window, watching Ben boost Lily up to nail a board into place, while Madison held the level steady. These were the moments her father would have called weakness, the choice to prioritize family time over career advancement, to find satisfaction in small accomplishments rather than grand gestures. But Amy had learned that strength came in many forms, and some of the most powerful acts were also the quietest ones. That evening, after the girls had been fed and Madison had been returned to her own family, Amy sat on the front porch with Ben and told him about the phone call. Lily was inside, practicing piano, her music drifting through the open windows along with the golden light of late summer. "What do you want to do?" Ben asked, his hand finding hers on the porch swing they'd installed the previous spring. "I keep thinking about all the other families like ours," Amy said slowly. People whose lives were destroyed by Thornfield Industries, who deserve to know that there are consequences for that kind of harm. She paused, listening to Lily's careful rendition of a Bach invention. Technically imperfect, but filled with the kind of joy that made imperfection irrelevant. But I also think about Lily, about the life we've built here, about whether stirring up the past serves anyone at this point. Ben was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the same thoughtfulness he brought to every important decision. Anna used to say that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose peace over justice, especially when you've already paid such a high price for doing what's right. Amy squeezed his hand, grateful as always for his ability to see complex situations clearly. "And sometimes," she replied, "the bravest thing is to keep fighting, even when you're tired of the battle." In the end, Amy chose to provide written testimony for her father's parole hearing rather than appearing in person. Her statement was clear and uncompromising. Harrison Thornfield had shown no genuine remorse for the lives he'd destroyed, and early release would send a dangerous message about accountability for corporate crimes. But she also made peace with whatever decision the parole board reached, understanding that she'd already reclaimed her life from her father's influence in the ways that mattered most. The hearing took place on a Tuesday in October, exactly 3 years after the runaway truck had changed everything. Amy spent the day helping at Lily's school fall festival, manning the ring toss booth and watching Ben judge the pie contest with the serious attention the role deserved. That evening, they learned that Harrison's parole had been denied. He would serve his full sentence, with the possibility of another hearing in 5 years. Amy felt a complex mix of relief and sadness, knowing that justice had been served while also grieving the final closure of a relationship that had once defined her entire world. But as autumn deepened into winter and their second Christmas as a family approached, Amy found herself thinking less about endings and more about continuations. Lily's piano skills had progressed to the point where she could play simple duets with Amy, their four hands creating harmonies that filled the house with music. Ben had expanded his workshop to include a small classroom where he taught woodworking to local teenagers, passing on skills that connected them to both tradition and possibility. And Amy's work at the community center had grown to include a mentorship program for young women from troubled backgrounds, offering them the kind of guidance and support she'd never received growing up in privilege but isolation. Their life had a rhythm now, a sense of purpose that felt both grounded and forward-looking. Some evenings, Amy would catch herself marveling at the ordinary magic of their existence: homework help and bedtime stories, grocery shopping and garden planning, the million small decisions that create a shared life. On New Year's Eve, as Cedar Falls celebrated with its traditional bonfire in the town square, Amy stood with her family watching sparks rise into the star-filled sky. Lily, now 8 and growing tall, leaned against Amy's side while Ben's arm encircled them both. Around them, their neighbors and friends counted down to midnight, voices joining in anticipation of whatever the new year might bring. As the clock struck 12 and the crowd erupted in cheers, Amy felt the profound contentment of someone who had found her place in the world not through birthright or achievement, but through the simple choice to love and be loved in return. The woman who had once stood motionless in a crosswalk, ready to let fate decide her future, was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that the best lives aren't the ones that look perfect from the outside, but the ones that feel genuine from within. And as Ben kissed her, while snow began to fall on the celebration around them, Amy knew that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary moments. A truck, a rescue, a choice to stay and see what might grow from the seeds of unexpected grace.